All right, how is everyone doing? Long day? Talking about cybersecurity things and all sorts of important stuff, huh? First, I want to apologize. My voice is going to be a little scratchy today. Turns out I'm highly allergic to whatever it is that's going on in Washington, D.C., and if you want to take that as a political joke, I won't stop you from interpreting it that way, but if I have to take a couple of breaks to drink some water, I apologize. I'm so honored to come here and talk to you all. You all have such an important job and role in our country, in our national security, in really the everyday lives of all Americans. And so it's just a real privilege to come here. I'm going to talk to you today about how we navigate a chaotic world. The topic, or the title of my talk is the VUCA Code. And for those of you who have served in the military, I imagine we have a couple of military veterans out in the crowd. Show of hands so I know who I'm trying to not run afoul of here, okay? We'll get into what VUCA is, how it was developed, but we'll use this as a framework for discussing chaos, and then talk about some of the methodologies that we can use to navigate today's chaotic and complex world. So first, let's just start with this very simple premise. The world is full of chaos. Now, I've been giving this talk for years. And about 2 years ago, it became even easier to convince audiences of this very simple premise because we found ourselves in the midst of a global pandemic that nobody really saw coming. Of course, in the last 45 days, this premise has become even more concrete and clear with the actions that have been taken by Russia in its illegal invasion of its neighboring democratic neighbor, the Ukraine. But it's not just global pandemics and war, it's the rapid evolution of technology. It's the shifting political environment underneath our feet. It's the shifting demographics that are challenging norms that we've seen last throughout generations. So if we can accept this premise as true, and if we can accept that no plan that we build as leaders of our organizations, no plan that we devise, no contingency plan, no backup plan to our backup plan survives first contact with the enemy, then the real question we have to answer is, when that chaos inevitably happens, how is it that we thrive in that moment? Now, I'm a big believer that amidst chaos, there's tremendous opportunity. Now, typically, I see these types of phrases and I roll my eyes because this is the type of thing that you'd typically see on a poster behind the desk of like your PE teacher. It's usually, framed, it's got a bald eagle on it, perched up on a cliff, and it's got some ism, right? Some saying, some ism of wisdom. Amidst chaos is opportunity, but I find this to be true. The best organizations, the best companies, the best teams, they find ways to not just exploit chaos, but in many ways to actually seek it out and use it to their advantage. Now, I imagine most people in this room try to avoid chaos like the plague. Your job is to prevent it from ever happening. But the reality is that it is inevitable. So we have to accept that as a truth. Now, the most important thing about thriving in chaos is to first understand it. In order to conquer chaos, we first have to decode chaos. So now, back in the 1980s, the US Army War College, seeing how the 20th century battlefield was rapidly shifting, set out to work and build a framework to define chaos. And they came up with something called VUCA. Now, if you can think about what was happening during the 1980s, this is the height of the Cold War. The Army was worried about state-on-state conflict with an enemy like Russia. Again, ironic that we stand here today, and this is exactly where we are. But think about what was happening in the 80s. You had the rapid shift in technology that was driving this revolution in communications technology. You had young lieutenants on both sides of the Atlantic with their fingers hovering over nuclear launch codes and buttons. You had the rise of hybrid warfare in places, in situations like the Iran-Contra war. You had, the proxy wars in Afghanistan that were going on, the ambiguity that naturally led to on the battlefield. And so understanding that the modern battlefield was going to have a level of chaos that was unprecedented in modern warfare, we set out to understand it. Now, VUCA, the framework they came up with, stands for volatility, uncertainty, complexity, and ambiguity. Now, many people look at these four words and they think that they're synonymous, that they are one and the same. But what's important to understand about this VUCA framework is that each element of this is a unique and distinct form of chaos. And understanding the type of chaos that you're facing helps you as a leader to understand the tactics and the techniques that will allow you to conquer it. Now, I first had my brush with VUCA when I joined the Marine Corps back in 2005. Now, my transition, my journey to the Marine Corps was not typical. I grew up for a good portion of my life actually thinking that I would join the military. I began the process of applying to West Point and the Annapolis Naval Academies, going so far as to get a nomination letter. I was talking to recruiters and exploring enlistment options, but my junior year in high school, I had this growth spurt. I jumped up to 6'6". I had a really good football season my junior year. Suddenly found myself with these opportunities to go and play football at major college programs. And so like any 18-year-old kid who had always had this lifelong ambition of serving his country, I made the mature choice when that time came, and I decided to go play football. I went to the University of Wisconsin on a full-ride athletic scholarship, go Badgers, and it was a great opportunity. I learned a ton during my 4 years on campus at the University of Wisconsin, but the reason why that factors into my story is that my freshman year, I woke up one morning, I walked down to the cafeteria to eat some breakfast before going to the stadium for practice. And I watched as the second plane hit the World Trade Center. You all remember where you were in that very moment. Some of you were probably in uniform on that very day. And in that moment, I knew that our country was at war. And at that moment, I knew that I'd made the wrong decision. But what did I do? Like many Americans, I didn't do anything. I ate my eggs, I went to practice, and that weekend we played Penn State. We won, by the way. And for the next 4 years, I got really good at making excuses for why some other young men and women would be the ones that would go off to war first in Afghanistan and later in Iraq. Got really good at making those excuses and watching those wars unfold from the comfort of my living room on campus. And then finally, right before my senior year, I turned on the news once again, and I saw the news that Pat Tillman had been killed in Afghanistan. And as a football player, that moment, that event resonated deeply with me. And I had this moment of self-reflection where I had to decide, do I want to be the type of person that Pat Tillman was, a man of conviction, somebody who made the right, necessary, hard choice regardless of personal cost? Or did I want to continue to pursue that life of luxury, for lack of a better word, that I had? Nonetheless, I decided in that moment that I was going to join the military. I chose to join the U.S. Marine Corps. After I played my last game with the Badgers, I walked into a Marine recruiter's office and I enlisted into the Marine Corps Infantry. And I was stationed in Southern California. I deployed later in 2007 to Iraq as part of the surge. I was being sent to a corner of the Anbar province outside of Fallujah. And for the entirety of 2007, my squad was leading counterinsurgency patrols at the height of the war. 2007, during the surge, was the deadliest year of the war in Iraq, and the part of Iraq that we were in was the deadliest corner of that country. And over the course of 7 months, I learned a lifetime's worth of lessons in leadership, but I also learned very fast what chaos on the battlefield looked like. Now, when I was training to prepare to go to Iraq, I'm pretty sure that none of my lieutenants or battalion commanders never once mentioned the word or the phrase VUCA. But what we were always talking about, what we were always training towards, was conquering the fog of war. A phrase that anyone, inside or out of the military, has likely heard. And so it was this concept of the fog of war that we are always training to overcome and conquer. And I saw it firsthand, day in and day out, when we were in Iraq. Now, I got back from Iraq, and I ended up trying out for and being selected into one of the Marine Corps Scout Sniper platoons. I was sent to Marine Corps Scout Sniper School, probably the hardest school to pass in the Marine Corps. It's got about a 70% failure rate. I started with 32 Marines from across the Marine Corps battalions and from the MARSOC, the Marine Special Operations Command. And out of those 32 Marines, about 14 of us ended up graduating. So actually a pretty high success rate relative to what it typically was for that school. And a few short months after graduation from that school, I was sent to Afghanistan, where over the course of 7 months, this 6-man Scout Sniper team that I was a part of was tasked with tracking and hunting Taliban and insurgent forces in a city called Sangin in the southern Helmand Valley. Probably not a more volatile and ambiguous environment on the planet than Sangin in the Helmand Valley in 2008. Every single night we would push our team out well beyond the reach of friendly forces into an environment that we knew little about, that was constantly shifting underneath our feet, and that was a veritable powder keg of volatility. And so over the course and throughout my time, my 4 years in the Marine Corps, I really understood firsthand how each of these elements played out. So if you think about what a volatile situation looks like, the signature weapon, the signature tactic of the enemies in Iraq was the IED, the roadside bomb. In an instant, a single IED could take what might have been a stretch of several days of relative calm and tranquility and ignite it in an instant that would make that environment go from 0 to 100 miles an hour. This is a photo that we took, a squad of Marines stationed on the top of this overpass, staring up and down this relatively busy highway in Iraq. And one afternoon, despite that outpost having never taken fire or ever had an attack over the course of 3 months, a truck laden with explosives pulled up underneath the overpass. The driver got out, walked away, and detonated that truck. Now, remarkably, every single Marine survived that. But that was volatility on the battlefield. If you think about complexity, I mentioned that I served during 2007. 2007 was a hallmark in the war because midway through that year, the U.S. was able to convince one of the two forces that we were fighting. If you probably may not recall, but the U.S. was at war on two fronts in Iraq. We were fighting al-Qaeda in Iraq, AQI. We were also fighting a Sunni insurgency that was born out of the Ba'athist Party. And this was a three-way conflict because the Sunnis were also fighting al-Qaeda. This was as complex a battlefield as you can imagine because it was a three-way war. Now, halfway through that deployment, we managed to actually reduce that complexity significantly because the CIA, the DIA, U.S. Special Operations under General Petraeus were able to convince the Sunnis to lay down their arms, to actually partner with us, and together we began battling al-Qaeda. One day I was battling these Sunni insurgents. That night I was told to go to a schoolhouse in the middle of Anbar province where, as I was holding security on the roof of that home, our lieutenant calls me on the radio and says, there's about to be about 25 Sunni fighters. They're going to walk out of that date palm grove. They're going to be armed. Don't fire. And we have no idea what's going on underneath us in that schoolhouse. Sure enough, they come in. The CIA collects their rifles, takes the serial numbers down, hands them a blue shirt, deputizes them into a militia, and 12 hours later, we go out on a patrol, and we're patrolling directly past the sworn enemy that had just been firing at us 24 hours earlier. That was complexity. You think about Afghanistan and the battlefield that we saw there, the uncertainty. Imagine our six-man team going on an insert in the middle of the night, trying to navigate to a firing position that we'd identified on a satellite map to support the movement of British troops through that area the following morning. As we're making our way through that terrain, we realize that the satellite maps are outdated. The buildings aren't where they're supposed to be. The roads are blocked. The canals are filled in. We have no sense of where we actually are. We finally set up right before the sun rises. Suddenly we see women and children begin going out into the fields to begin their work, working the fields. We see military-aged males come up on motorcycles, begin whispering in the ears of the women. And suddenly the women scurry off. We haven't been able to talk to the British unit that we're supposed to be supporting for over 3 hours. We've lost radio contact. We have no idea where they are, but we knew that they were supposed to be moving through the area 90 minutes ago, and we can't see them. Then suddenly, gunfire erupts. Who is it? Is it the British unit? Is it the Taliban? Where's it even coming from? We have no idea. That level of uncertainty defined the battlefield that we were on every single day. And then finally, ambiguity. Who here is from the Midwest? All right, we do this weird thing in the Midwest where every fall we have these big cornfields. And right around Halloween, what's every big cornfield in the Midwest do? They make a maze, and they do play on words there, right? And they make this maze, and then they charge you $10 to walk through the maze in the middle of the night, and the maze is haunted. People jump out of the corn stalks at you, and you're trying to work your way through this corn. It's exactly what we would do every night. We'd go out into these cornfields outside of Sangin. The corn would be 8 feet tall, towering above our heads in the middle of the night. We'd be trying to silently make our way through that cornfield, when all of a sudden we would hear something snap 15 meters off to our right in the cornfield. And we'd pause. We'd hold our breath. We wouldn't hear anything. We'd start moving again, and then snap. You'd hear it again. That sound was somebody hunting us. That sound was the Taliban tracking us, the predator becoming the prey. This level of ambiguity where you didn't know up from down. You had no sense of the world, no sense of direction, no understanding of the world around you in that very moment. That level of ambiguity gripping us on every single night mission that we would have to run. And so yes, though I didn't have necessarily an academic background in VUCA, in risk management, every single day for 4 years, this was the world that I was living in. So now let's actually break these down and understand them a little bit better. Again, this is how we're going to have a better, deeper understanding of the chaos that we're going to face in the world. So volatility. How do we define volatility? Volatility is a rapid deviation from a norm. We understand the factors that are at play, but we don't control them. And the duration of that volatility is unknown. So think about the stock market. We understand the levers that make the stock market work. We understand the impact of inflation on stock prices, interest rates on stock prices. But there are all of these factors that we don't control. We might try to control some of them. We might try to control inflation, but oftentimes we're very limited in what we control. And then there are these external factors of which we have zero predictability or control. A member of the UN Security Council invades their neighbor. The price of oil shoots through the roof. These are things that, though we tried to predict Russia's invasion of Ukraine, we only had certain information about it. We certainly could not outright stop it from happening. And now here we are, seeing that volatility play out in something like the stock market, and we have no control. We have no understanding of the duration that this is going to go on. So that's volatility. Now, one of the key factors in being able to survive a volatile situation is being able to create time and space, either figuratively or literally. In other words, try to create some slack in your systems. Now, if we're drawing upon that market analogy, the stock market analogy, that might mean that you have a long-term investment time horizon. The underlying near-term volatility of the stock market actually doesn't mean much to you. It might even just create a buying opportunity because you have dry powder, dry capital to deploy. Otherwise, you don't need liquidity right now, and you can afford, again, time and space to wait that volatility out. So thinking about how you can create time and space in your organizations, standoff in your organizations for those unexpected and uncertain and volatile moments is something that's critically important. Now, uncertainty. The thing about uncertainty is that we have a lot of information about the situation that we're facing, but we're lacking certain very specific decision-critical information for what we need to do. So the perfect analogy here is blackjack. Who here's played blackjack? Who here played blackjack last night? Be honest. Nobody? Somebody's a liar. You'll take this hand. Yeah, who wouldn't, right? So blackjack is a really fascinating game. Blackjack is governed by the rules of statistics and probability. There is a right answer for every single situation that you face on a blackjack table. Now, a right answer does not necessarily mean a winning answer, but a right answer means that there is a correct decision that does not necessarily dictate an outcome for every single moment. Now, let's talk through a blackjack scenario for a moment. What's the most dreaded hand to be dealt at a blackjack table? 16, right? So you get a hard 16, you're playing the game, and you see the dealer has a face card up. Now, one of the assumptions that a player has to make in blackjack is that the dealer's down card, the one that you cannot see, is a face card. So if the dealer has a face card up, you assume that the dealer has a hand worth 20 points. Again, because you're assuming that they have a face card down. So if you have a hard 16, 11 out of the 13 possible cards that you might get dealt either sink you immediately or do nothing to actually solve your situation. There are only 2 cards that can save you, the 4 and the 5. Those are really terrible odds. Now, if you had perfect decision quality information, meaning you knew what the dealer's down card was, your entire decision tree would change. Because what do you have to do if you're dealt with a hard 16 against a face card? You have to take a card. You have to take a card. Statistically speaking, you have to take a card. If you stay, you will win only 26% of the time. If you take a card, you will win 30% of the time. Your odds don't increase dramatically, but over 100 hands, it's a statistically significant difference, 26 to 30%. You've increased your chances of winning by 4%. But if you had perfect information, if you knew that the dealer didn't have a 10 underneath, that the dealer had a 5, and now it's your hard 16 against the dealer's hard 15, your decision completely changes. Now you stay, and you hope, because the statistical probability of losing is now placed on the dealer, but you don't have perfect information. But here's the interesting thing about uncertain situations. Here's what's interesting about what happens at the blackjack table. Even though it's universally accepted that you must take that card, and we know exactly how much it improves your chances of winning, what do people do? They stay. They make an irrational decision in the face of those statistics because they have fear. Uncertainty creates this human element of fear. And fear leads us to do crazy things. So managing through uncertainty, in many ways, for both yourself and your team, is managing fear. Now we get to complexity. And what's interesting here is that this is the opposite of uncertainty. Here, complexity is defined not as the absence of decision-critical information. This is defined as the overwhelming volume of information and the interconnectedness of our decisions that lead to analysis paralysis. So here, the options that you must explore are limitless. So let's think about chess for a second. There are 20 possible opening moves on the chessboard for each player. So if you've got the black pieces, you've got 20 possible opening moves. Your opponent will have 20 possible opening moves. That means that there are 400 possible combinations of the board after just 2 moves. Now after that, the board starts to open up. You have, on average, between 30 and 40 possible moves on each subsequent turn. After each player has taken 2 turns, there are roughly 72,000 combinations of the board. After each player's just taken 2 turns. Who wants to take a stab after 3 turns? 9 million. After 4 turns, how many possible combinations of the board do you think a player would have had the opportunity to evaluate? Just take a stab. It's gonna blow your mind. 288 billion. Think about that for a second. That's an overwhelming volume of information to analyze. Am I right? Good players think a couple of moves ahead in chess. Great players think 3-order, 4th-order consequences ahead. That decision tree of, if I do this, here are the possible defenses or counter moves that my opponent might make. If on average you have 30 possible moves at your disposal, that means your opponent has 30 possible counters to every single one of those. Just the second-order consequence of any decision in chess has 900 possible scenarios to evaluate. So what do the great players do? The great players know which are terrible moves and which are good moves, which are likely counters and which are unlikely counters, which means that their data set that they have to evaluate, their optionality they have to evaluate, immediately shrinks to the 10 or 20 most likely scenarios. And their mental energy is not expended upon wasteless evaluations and circumstances or any of these other things. And their mental energy is focused on these 10 because their experience has led them to know what the right options are in that moment. This is where great leaders thrive. This is where great teams bring in outside perspective to help them evaluate these scenarios. This is where great leaders demonstrate humility and acknowledge that they may not have the experience and bring in peers or even subordinates to say, help me think through the picture that I'm looking at right now. That takes a certain level of humility, though. Now, finally, we get to ambiguity. Again, it's that damn maze. Ambiguity is a moment in which there is no precedent for us to apply. Up is no longer up, down is no longer down, 1 plus 1 no longer equals 2, it somehow equals 3, and we can't figure out why. Ambiguous situations are terrifying, and they are lethal, both figuratively and, in some cases, tragically, literally. Because here's what happens. Human beings, we have this tendency, this human desire to apply frameworks, past experiences, to things that we're observing. It's actually how we survive. Again, going back to why great chess players are really good about complexity is they can apply a lens because they've seen almost every possible circumstance before, and they've learned from it. But again, if an ambiguous situation truly has no precedent, then all of your experience is almost rendered moot. And the danger is that you apply a false precedent, a false assumption, a false framework to a moment for which it doesn't apply. And that can lead to horrific outcomes. There's a lot of examples of what this might look like. I think an extreme example that really drives this home, you hear these tragic stories in some of these shootings that occur. And one that always stuck in my mind was, several years ago, probably 4, 5, 6 years ago, when that awful shooting happened in Las Vegas at that country music festival. Guy up in a hotel tower using an automatic weapon, firing down into a crowd, killed 65 people, whatever that number was. It was terrible. And you heard some of the survivors talking to reporters afterward, and they'd say, yeah, I heard the gunfire, but I thought it was a drummer warming up. Now, if you've never been under fire, and that's not like I've been under fire, it's not like something I'm proud of, right? But it's unmistakable what being under fire, what having bullets snap past your head sounds like. There is no other sound on the planet like that. But if you've never heard that, then yeah, you might conflate incoming gunfire if you're at a country music festival with a drummer warming up. But you're applying a false precedent to a situation that is for you entirely ambiguous. And what did it lead to? It led to a lot of people standing around saying, man, what is that? Instead of running for cover immediately, instead of understanding that the moment that they were experiencing was something that they had never experienced before and that it was likely dangerous and they needed to get away. So the thing about ambiguity for leaders is having that self-awareness, of being able to acknowledge that this is something that I'm completely unprepared for, which then actually allows you to prepare yourself and your team to overcome it. Now, after I got out of the military, I thought kind of my time with VUCA environments was going to come to a conclusion, but shortly after I got out of the Marine Corps, I thought I was going to go get my MBA, and I wanted to be an entrepreneur. I wanted to go work for a company and do that whole startup thing. As I was waiting for my MBA applications to come back, about 60 days after I got out of the Marines, I turned on the TV and I saw this image come across. This is January 2010, and this image is coming out of Port-au-Prince, Haiti. As I sat there and I watched this situation unfold on TV, I couldn't help but think how similar it was to the environment I'd just gotten out of for the previous 4 years. The hopelessness, the despair, the destruction, the chaos that was on the ground in Port-au-Prince in the aftermath of what was ultimately one of the worst humanitarian catastrophes of the last 100 years. 150,000 people died almost instantaneously in that earthquake. Another 100,000 people are estimated to have died in the weeks following it because of lack of medical attention, lack of water, poor hygiene, violence. This was chaos incarnate. As I sat there and watched this unfold again, I felt like I had the opportunity to go down and thrive in that environment to help those people in that moment on their worst day. And so I called a couple of the Marines that I'd served with. We ended up getting a team of doctors and military veterans, some Marines, a couple of Army Special Forces veterans, and we got down to Port-au-Prince about 4 days after the earthquake. We started running these medical triage clinics all throughout the city. We'd go to parts of Port-au-Prince that other organizations either could not or would not go to. Parts of Port-au-Prince that you wouldn't go to before a massive 7.0 earthquake devastated the entire city. And over the course of about 3 weeks, what we came to understand was that all we were doing is applying the counterinsurgency principles that we'd learned in the Marine Corps to this new humanitarian environment. risk assessment and mitigation, small unit leadership, operational planning, logistics, all of those things that allowed us to thrive on the battlefields of Iraq and Afghanistan were easily translated into this environment. And so we came back from Port-au-Prince, and we ended up incorporating a nonprofit organization with the intent of building the best disaster response organization in the world, on the simple premise that if we recruited the men and women coming back from Iraq and Afghanistan to repurpose their skill sets in this new construct, that we could build a better mousetrap. And we called that organization Team Rubicon. And over the course of the last 12 years, Team Rubicon has gone from an initial 8 volunteers that went down to Haiti to a global network of over 150,000 volunteers across the country and in Canada who have responded to over 1,000 disasters, catastrophes, and humanitarian crises over the last decade, some of the most complex situations on the planet. And time again, we have proven that we can cut through that chaos and render aid in these critical moments. And we've learned some really incredible lessons along the way for how we do that. I'll spend the last 10 or 15 minutes talking about some of those basic lessons. So first, some of the situations that we've responded to. In 2013, Typhoon Haiyan, the most powerful typhoon to ever make landfall in recorded history, slammed into the Philippines, specifically made ground zero in an area in the southern Philippines called the Southern Leyte province, completely cut off from the outside world as soon as it hit. Team Rubicon, 3 years old, was the first foreign search and rescue team on the ground in Tacloban, which is the city that was at the literal ground zero of that storm. We got there before USAID, we got there before the US military, we got there before the the Philippines gave us the ride, so we got there at the same time. And we got there before any other large non-governmental organization got there on the ground. Organizations that had multi-billion-dollar budgets. We did not get there because we had access to our own planes. We didn't get there because we had millions and millions of dollars in our budget. We didn't get there for any of those resourcing reasons. We got there because of an attitude, a cultural understanding of what it takes to thrive in that environment, to empower those teams with the necessary authority to make decisions on the fly when they're asynchronous in their decision cycle from the command and control element that was in the United States. And eventually they got down there, about 2 days after that storm passed over. You fast forward a couple more years, 2017, Hurricane Harvey. Many of you guys remember Hurricane Harvey. To contextualize Hurricane Harvey, if you don't remember, Hurricane Harvey hit the Texas Gulf Coast. It dumped, over the course of 96 hours in Houston, it dumped 30 trillion gallons of water in Houston in 96 hours. It's enough to fill 15,000 New Orleans Superdomes to the top. Dumped on one city in 96 hours. About 2 days after the storm, had made landfall, the police chief for Houston made an unprecedented request to the public. He got on TV and he asked the public, any citizen, any private citizen with a flat-bottom boat, to put that boat in the water and go out there and try to rescue their neighbors. For a public safety official to ask every single Tom, Dick, and Harry out there to put their boat in the water and begin going out there, risking their lives to rescue people, tells you how extraordinary of a circumstance that was. Team Rubicon did not have boats before Hurricane Harvey made landfall. We had boats within hours of our understanding of how severe that flooding was going to be in that rescue operation. We recruited boat rescue specialists from across, Navy backgrounds, fire and rescue backgrounds. We had teams in the water about 9 hours later. Again, not because we were the best resourced organization on the planet, but because we knew how to navigate that chaos and that uncertainty better than anybody else. 2018, Hurricane Dorian hits the Bahamas. Category 5 storm, sits on top of the Bahamas for about 50 hours. There's not a single, and I got there. I had to take a boat from Nassau because the helicopter didn't pick me up. I got there about 2 days after our team, and I saw this for myself. There was not a single power pole, not one power pole on that island survived. The entire electrical grid knocked out for an unknown duration. The port destroyed, the airport destroyed. We dropped our medical teams onto the ground alongside chainsaw teams. We cleared hundreds of miles of roadways over the course of the next couple of days, treated hundreds of patients. We had no idea when we were going to be able to resupply them because of the uncertainty around the logistics. Again, we weren't able to do that because we had the most. We were able to do that because we were the best at navigating the chaos. And then finally, we talked about plans. This whole conference has been about creating your battle plan. Nobody had a plan for COVID. I thought you were going to raise your hand and tell me that you had one. Just messing with his hair. It's good hair. Nobody had a plan for this. The CDC didn't have a plan for this, at least not one that they were able to implement effectively. We didn't have a playbook for this, but we knew that we had the players. We knew that we had the team. And while every other company was shutting down, every other disaster and humanitarian organization was shutting down alongside every single Fortune 500 company, we were identifying ways within 24 hours to push our teams out into community in a highly decentralized way, to make contact with local officials, and identify ways that we could support their efforts to support COVID-19. And what did that look like? We operated in over 500 communities over the course of 2020, and that ranged from managing the entire emergency health system of Navajo Nation, where we treated 10,000 patients in Navajo Nation, to rapidly partnering with one of Google's subsidiary companies to develop roll out a rapid test across the Western US when testing was still a thing that nobody could have access to. Did hundreds of thousands of tests, mobile testing sites with Google, packaged and delivered 60 million pounds of food, and we ultimately ended up facilitating nearly 2 million vaccinations in low-income and rural communities as soon as that vaccine was made available. Again, no playbook for that, but we knew we had the players. And so as we have thought about this VUCA environment that we've been working in, we've begun to think about what are the frameworks that help you thrive in this environment. Now, there's the tactical elements that allow you to thrive at a tactical level. And I break them down this way. Velocity, how quickly can you act? Speed to decision, speed to action. Understanding, can you create that shared consciousness across your team? Can you get everyone to be acting, singing off the same sheet of music? Clarity, is there crystal clear understanding of roles, of functions, of responsibilities in your organization? If you don't have that, everything will grind to a halt. And finally, agility. Do you have an organization in which you can empower individuals and teams to go out there and make consequential decisions in the face of that chaos? Those are the tactics that help you thrive. But I'm going to spend the last 10 minutes talking about the foundations of any great organization that requires you in advance to be ready for these moments, okay? And those four things are vision, uniformity, culture, and alignment. We'll dig into these real quick, and then we'll leave some time for some questions here. So I refer to these as the foundations for any company. So the first is vision. Now, I think anybody here who's a leader understands that vision setting is leadership 101. It's pretty clear, right? Organizations have visions, teams have visions, leaders have visions. When we came back from Haiti, we said that this was our vision. We want to build the best damn disaster response organization in the world. Now, admittedly, that was probably a little ambitious for a couple of knuckle-dragging Marines who had never built anything before. But what's important here is that effective visions have 3 ingredients, and they're very simple. They have to be bold, they have to be relatable, and they have to be simple, right? Simple, bold, and relatable. They can't use ambiguous language. They have to speak to everyone in an organization. Somebody has to hear it and understand how it matters to them. And it has to be bold. It has to be inspiring. People have to hear it and say, yeah, I want to be a part of that. I want to accomplish that. I want to see that to conclusion. That's all really easy to do. Simple, bold, and relatable. Look how simple that vision was for us. This is not hard. This takes you 30 minutes at a whiteboard to figure out. The hard part comes next. So to use a different example, Southwest Airlines, their vision is to become the world's most loved, most flown, most profitable airline. Now, if I had not told you that was Southwest Airlines, I probably could have told you that it was American or United or Delta. Probably could not have convinced you it was Spirit. If you've ever flown Spirit. But you probably, if I told you this was American Airlines, you probably would have been like, yeah, sure, okay, yeah. Who wouldn't want to be most loved, most flown, most profitable? Makes sense. It's bold, it's simple, it's relatable. But this moment I tell people that it's Southwest Airlines, they all kind of nod their head and they're, oh, yeah, I get it. Why is that? Because this sounds really nice. Who wouldn't want to be most loved? But what we know for a fact is that Southwest Airlines is the only major carrier that has ever been committed to having that type of relationship with its customers. United and American and Delta, they might say they want to have great customer service, but they make decisions actively that run counter to that. So the hard part about vision setting is you can make it simple, you can make it bold, you can make it relatable, but if you don't have the fortitude, the courage to then align every single decision and action that you take to that vision, then it all falls apart. Then it adds no value to you or your team because they immediately see a disconnect between what you say you want to accomplish and what you're willing to do to get there. So if United had said we want to be the most loved, but then it's dragging people off the airplane by their hair, their employees immediately know, actually, we don't really have to live up to that because it doesn't matter to our team. But then you see Southwest Airlines eschewing all of these industry norms, not charging for checked bags, not charging for change fees. Things that people thought they were crazy for, but they knew aligned to this vision. Now this became a powerful North Star for every single employee in the company. That is the hard part about being a leader and using vision to lead. Uniformity. So one of the things Team Rubicon will do after a hurricane, we'll go out there, we'll blue tarp roofs, right? So that there's not, additional damage that's sustained in that house. That's a pretty dangerous activity. I don't want those knuckleheads up there on that high-angle roof in the aftermath of a storm discussing how to blue tarp a roof when they get up there. I don't want them debating the right way and the wrong way, or this is the way I do it, this is the way you should do it. I want them to have a uniform understanding of what those standards and that expectation is. Uniformity unlocks potential in organizations. I often use the example of when I was on that sniper team in Afghanistan, I could call for fire, and I'd never have had to meet the pilot that was flying at literally the speed of sound, dropping a 2,000-pound bomb near me. Never had to meet that person because I had a standard call for fire format that I would use. In fact, half the time we were in Afghanistan, that person I was calling for fire from, for close air support, wasn't even American. Didn't even speak English as their first language. But because we had uniform standards across the NATO alliance, that worked. And I could trust that that bomb was going to land where it was supposed to. If you look at what's happening right now, some of the thrash that's going on with how do we get Ukraine what it needs is they don't have uniform military equipment as to the rest of NATO. That's creating a major challenge for them on the ground. It's making a chaotic situation worse. I now run a software company as my full-time job. We've only been doing it for about 9 months. I'm learning that our product team and our engineering team don't have uniform understandings of very simple words like what is done. You think that causes problems between a product team and an engineering team? What does job complete mean? So oftentimes you'll have people lament that uniformity, oh, you're shutting down my creativity. Oh, this is stifling bureaucracy. No. We create uniform standards and ways of doing things for those routine tasks that we should not be expending mental energy upon, so that we can reserve our creative capacity, our creative energy, for those truly novel situations and problems that arise in chaotic situations. If you're already thrashing around on the simple stuff, when the really complex things happen, you ain't got time for that. So create that uniformity. Culture. I have entire talks that I give about culture. I love talking about this topic. I'll break it down quickly because I think we're approaching time here. So culture guides decisions in the absence of orders. That's how I learned culture in the Marine Corps. Culture guides decisions in the absence of orders. When there wasn't someone there telling you what to do, how did you know what to do, right? That's what makes the Marine Corps really special. That the empowerment of what we call the strategic corporal. Someone who understood commander's intent and then had the culture of 243 years of Marine Corps history to guide those Marines consistently to the right outcome. So how do you get there? Obviously it starts with ethical leadership and vision. We talked about that. How do you make the right decision if you don't know where you're going? That's why vision is so critical. Early, you can build teams around people. You could hire for culture, but that doesn't scale. It doesn't scale past about 100 people, right? So eventually you have to inculcate this across the entire organization. The organization has to embody that culture and not just the leader or his or her lieutenants or the first 100 people you hire. So what happens is you have to incorporate those virtues that are kind of universal, things like trust, respect, all those things, into the values of your organization. Now, values are how those things uniquely manifest in your organization. So trust, universally admired, doesn't matter where you were born, trust, respect, courage, those things. But trust in your organization might mean something differently than trust in yours. And that's okay. That difference is just what makes your organizations unique. But if you don't understand that, then your organization is not going to be strong. But just like creating creating a vision that is simple, bold, and relatable, is inspiring, and speaks to people is really actually easy in practice, the hard part with values is not crafting snappy values that get people excited and think that they're really cool. The hard part is then aligning the entire company, the entire organization around those values to reinforce them. This is where leaders get it wrong. They'll Google, how do I write my corporate values? And they'll usually find Google's corporate values because they're pretty famous. And they'll say, oh, those sound pretty good. You know, you copy, paste, you change a couple of things, you throw them up in the entryway of the office, you put them above the urinal, so you're like, oh, everybody's reading them every day. But then you have a disconnect between what you say you value and then the mechanics of your company. If you say that you trust people, but you require them to submit a receipt for a $2 latte, I don't know, do you trust them to be expending the company's funds sufficiently? If you say that you treat people like family, but you don't offer paid family leave, do you really treat your people like family? So creating alignment between how you run your company and what you state your values are is where most leaders get this wrong. And ultimately, this leads to actions and outcomes. Now, one of my mentors, Bob McDonnell, used to be one of the secretary of the VA, said to me once, Jake, every single outcome that a company gets had a culture perfectly designed to achieve it, good or bad. So if you're getting consistently bad outcomes, go and diagnose your culture and determine what underlying in your culture is leading to that consistently bad outcome. Likewise for good outcomes. And then how can you figure out how to translate that across your organization and ingrain it across everything that you do? And then you scale this with good storytelling. Creating that history, those ceremonies, those artifacts. I often say that, one of the things that I learned at the School of Infantry is, the instructors would spend, we'd have a 30-minute period of instruction on how to respond to a close ambush. And it would start in front of a chalkboard. They'd draw the X's and O's like a football coach, like John Madden at the whiteboard. And then they'd spend 5 minutes talking about the X's and O's of a close ambush. And then they'd spend 25 minutes telling us stories of Marines on Guadalcanal, in Khe Sanh, in Fallujah, who experienced a close ambush, because they knew that when the bullets would start flying, we wouldn't remember the X's and O's. But it was going to be the culture that they had ingrained in us, the memory of what those prior Marines had done, that would actually inspire us to the right decisions and to the right actions, because we would live up to that culture that preceded us. How do you do that in your organization? If you're not thinking about how you tell those stories, if you create those ceremonies, enrich that history, you're missing an opportunity. And that brings me to my final point, which is alignment. If you're doing your job and you're going out and you're getting all these high performers, you're bringing them together in this team, you're creating a culture, how do you actually align those people to that vision? How do you get them to agree to almost subjugate their own ambition in certain ways and align to that vision, that mission, the objectives of your company? And I think that it all comes back to this. It all comes back to that storytelling. I think every single organization on the planet is nothing but a story. It's got a founding, chapter 1. It's got a vision, that epilogue, how everything ties together in the end. And in between, it's got this plot. And just like any story, like any plot line, it's got twists and turns. It's got protagonists and antagonists. It's got surprises. And if you think about your people as the characters of your story, nobody, and I'll say this flat out, nobody in here, when you think about yourself in a story, thinks about yourself as an inconsequential character in that story. We close our eyes at night, and we think about ourselves in the grander scheme of the universe. We think about ourselves in someone's story. You hope that your team is thinking about themselves vis-a-vis the story of your company, your team. If they don't close their eyes and think about themselves being some unnamed character on page 56, they aspire to be a hero in that story. And here's what's fascinating. If you treat them like unnamed characters on page 56, they're going to show up to work and they're going to put in unnamed character effort. You treat them like a hero in your organization's story, they're going to show up every day and they're going to put in heroic effort. They're going to rise to the occasion, and they're going to help your organization overcome in those inevitable moments of chaos. So I always challenge people to treat their people like heroes in the story of your organization, the narrative arc of your company, so that ultimately you can get to that epilogue, that vision that you've all set out to accomplish, and you actually get there and achieve it. So I'm going to go ahead and conclude there. I think we went a little bit over, 10 minutes, 10 minutes for questions, if we have questions. If you don't, I don't know if there's a cocktail reception or not, but I feel pretty dangerous right now if there was.
If you have questions, we ask that you please line up in the back right here for the microphone.
Right here?
I do have one.
Yeah. I think yeah. Yeah, so I mean, a culture is going to develop whether a leader is deliberately cultivating it or not. It just won't be a strong culture. It won't be one that's designed for the outcomes that leader's aiming to achieve. In young companies, culture is a speedboat. And in big companies, culture is an aircraft carrier. And you're right, it's hard to turn. But the good news is that if you built it the right way, built a good aircraft carrier, and it's on the right azimuth, you don't mind that inertia, because it's exactly what brings you power. But if it's something that's been neglected, if it's something that's proven to be, weak or even worse, toxic, it's really challenging. I think that there's a couple of things. Don't ever, again, with what I concluded with, that alignment and that storytelling, I think we often see the performance and attitudes of people and resign ourselves to thinking that that's just how they are, versus thinking, how have we not tapped into that person's unique talent and capability yet? How have we not inspired them to bring a better version of themselves to work? Now, listen, at the end of the day, some people just don't have the talent, they don't have the skill, they don't have the attitude. I mean, that is a fraction of people in a culture. I think more often than not, leaders have left things on the table with their people. They have not unlocked that potential. So I always encourage people to start there. Now, that also includes like cutting out the cancer, right? So if you have people that are toxic to that culture, as a leader, you cannot be afraid. You cannot hesitate to eliminate those people. But that's always where I start. All right. Well, hey, such a pleasure joining you today. I allow myself one trip a year to DC. So glad I got to spend it with you all. I'll be out back if you do have a question you want to ask. Also, I wrote a book 2 years ago. There are free copies of the book out there if you'd like it. It's called Once a Warrior. Tom Brokaw, a legendary journalist, said, "It's the book America needs right now." So I was very flattered by that. I encourage you to read it. It tells you the story of Team Rubicon, which hopefully provides you some source of inspiration in a world where I think we're often needing and searching for inspiration. So thank you. Have a safe trip back to wherever you are.